go till 3:30 or 4?
We'll try to wrap up around 3:30, and then I'll stick around for another half hour if there are any question and answer, like a question and answer session.
Okay.
Are you good? Is it going? Okay. Well, thanks for coming. I know that it's a little bit early to start thinking about it, but it really isn't, because there's a lot of material. Please, there's the core concept reading list that hopefully you all have. Also, if you go into your Moodle webpage, there's San Francisco Comprehensive Examinations that Dr. Patel put in, and then you can download this document for yourself and get other information about the comps. So that's a good resource. Something else that I wanted to show you before we begin, because I think it might be useful for your assessment classes as well as in studying for the comps, is the Graduate Tutorial Services website on Moodle. If you go to and you click on that, there's all the tutors and all the tutoring services that are available. If you go to the very bottom, it's Zoe and my webpage, and we're posting different study materials or things that might be really helpful as you're thinking about that. I have a couple of things that I'm going to go over today. Something that is probably the most useful for comps is this document test to be aware of, which is an Excel spreadsheet. And it has all the tests that are covered either formally or informally for the comp. And it has, I have the acronym, like how it's commonly referred to, the full name, what it measures, age range, also if there are any other versions, like integrated or a children's version if it's not specifically said. Also, any notes about things that are important to note, whether it's a verbal test or a nonverbal test, and also a link to the publisher's website, which gives a lot of information about the test. So if you go to the publisher website, it's sort of a way of getting a Cliff's Notes about what the test is all about, telling you how it's broken down, what the major indices are. So if you don't really want to check out the test because it's one that you don't have to know very much in depth, that's another place that's a place to go, and obviously it's not a replacement for knowing more about the test. As you see, there are some of these that are bolded. Those are the ones that you should really know and you should get intimately familiar with. The others you don't necessarily have to know all that much about. So going to the publisher's website and looking to see any presentations that might be available online should be good enough. I think that's how I studied. So that's. The other thing is when you look over the core concept list, there are a couple words that are a little bit tricky. There's a difference between, let's see. Something like introductory knowledge means you have to know about the test, what it's about, but you don't necessarily have to know all the indices, what sort of test items are there. Other ones, it just says, for the WISC, for instance, you just have to know it inside and out, essentially. There's.
I'm sorry, for the introductory knowledge of the Wechsler Scales, you said that, what was it that we don't need to know about?
No. Whenever you look here, so the question was sort of how to tell the difference, I guess, whether it's introductory knowledge, and that's straight from the core concept. Some of them say introductory knowledge. Some of them say clinical working knowledge, which means you probably should be able to interpret them a little bit. Mm-hmm. And others, where it doesn't say anything, it says actually detailed knowledge means you have to know it inside and out, both in terms of development, use, applicability, and interpretation. Did that answer your question? So definitely when you're looking over this, that's not necessarily all that clear in terms of how much you have to put into it, but that's sort of general guidelines, and pay attention to whether it says working knowledge, introductory knowledge, general knowledge. Those are things that saying you wouldn't have to be able to interpret a profile. Oops. Are there any other questions? A couple other things are there's a PDF with the different achievement tests that are most commonly used, mainly the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, the Wyatt-3, and the RAD-4, and it breaks them down into subtests. But that's a little bit more in depth than we need to go into today, so if you're interested, it's very useful when you're writing assessment reports. Okay. Are there any questions before we go on, before we begin with more of what we're going to talk about today? Okay. So today we're going to talk about cognitive and educational assessment, which is about 30% of what you need to know for the comps. So 30% of the questions that are going to be related to the information that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be roughly going through the core concepts, what do you need to know. It's a very broad topic, and definitely what you need to know for the comps is not necessarily everything you need to know about it. But I think this is something that we're probably familiar with to some degree. A few disclaimers before we start. Like, what I'm going to be talking about is not a substitute for your own studying. There are some things that I'm not going to go as in-depth as you probably need to know it for the comps. So don't think that everything that I'm presenting is exactly what you need to know. You still need to do your own studying based on the core concept list. I'm going to try to cover as much as I can, but there's no time for me to cover everything. Also, this is material that I've gathered and based on my knowledge and my research, but it's not something that I've developed in conjunction with the faculty or sort of the committee that approves and does the comps. So keep in mind that I'm pretty sure it's mostly right, but there might be a few things that are not super accurate. And as I already said, it's about 30% of what you need to know. So quite a bit. So I think it's sometimes nice to begin with, well, what are we looking at? And like when you put assessment in the grander scheme of things, what are the types of assessment that we do and what are the difference between them? And I think having that very clear is helpful in knowing, like, when you look at a new test or you're trying to learn a new test, where does it fit in with everything else? In general, they can be broadly categorized into ability tests and personality tests. Ability tests measure skills or ability to do some task. And they're divided into sort of achievement, which measures previous learning, things that students or people should already learn probably. Or you want to see how much they've already learned. And aptitude is sort of the potential for acquiring a specific skill. We don't really talk about those as much in clinical work because they're more for employment screening. Like, will this person be able to perform well? Like the GRE is probably a good example of an aptitude test. And also intelligence, which is how to solve, it has novel stimuli, it's a way of solving novel problems, changing circumstances, and it's not something that you've already learned, but rather using skills that you have or things that you're born with into how you can apply them. And we'll talk essentially about intelligence and achievement today. On the other side are personality tests, which we'll cover in the rest of the review sessions. And so those are divided essentially into projective, which are a self-report assessment of certain things, and a projective test, which qualifies the responses that a person has to ambiguous stimuli. So today we're essentially only talking about ability tests, and in particular achievement and intelligence. We're also going to be talking a little bit about how we can use these tests, essentially achievement and intelligence, for diagnosing different disabilities or giftedness, and also how you can use those same tests for neuropsychological findings. Because that's a small part of the comp, but it still is going to be there. Any questions? No? Okay. So we're going to start with intelligence tests, because that's essentially the biggest component of what we're going to talk about, and we'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about that. And if you have any questions, raise your hand. I'll be happy to stop, clarify anything. So please do. Well, intelligence, ever since they started, they have been very controversial. And they've been controversial because the definitions of intelligence are not concrete. They're very culturally based and based on values and like what type of problems are necessary for somebody to be considered intelligent is going to be different here than in a nomadic Middle Eastern society, for instance. So they're controversial because the potential uses of intelligence is very powerful. People can be used for placement and have been used for placement in academic and social institutions. And so there's a lot of power in these tests, and so we have to keep that in mind. And we'll talk more about how they're currently used, but like IQ testing has a very, very dark history in our field. When we talk about intelligence, and we'll talk about different models in just a few slides, but currently psychologists think that there are certain elements, there's a consensus about what are the different elements of intelligence. And those are sort of abstract thinking and reasoning, which is being able to draw generalizations from conclusions in abstract terms and being able to apply that. Also the ability to solve problems. So if you have something that you've never worked with before and you have to reach a solution, like how would you go about doing that? Another part of intelligence is the capacity to acquire knowledge. So how easy it is for a person to learn something new. Memory is also a part of intelligence because it's important to be able to hold information in and do all the other things that I've been talking about. Also, it's adaptations to one's environment, which is less academic and more of a social phenomenon. How much can a person go into a new environment and be able to deal with new problems that arise? Mental speed is just how quickly can you do these tasks? How quickly can you get new information? How quickly can you apply new information or old information? And also linguistic competence, which is how you can articulate, present concepts verbally and understand verbal material. So there are a lot of every different definition of intelligence, which you should probably go and read a little bit about. There are a bunch of different theories, and they all have different aspects, but currently, at least based on Jerome Sadler, these are sort of the consensus of what constitutes intelligence. And when going to that, I said that definitions of intelligence are tied into different theories. And there are essentially two different theories, or two different camps of theories about intelligence. There's a multi-factor theories, which are exemplified by Thorndike, Thurstone, Guilford, and Cattell and Horn. Essentially, those say that there is no such thing as intelligence, per se, but rather that there are a bunch of different separate abilities that come together in a person. And so another multi-factor theory, for instance, would be the theory of multiple intelligences proposed by Howard Gardner, saying that there's no just one intelligence, but rather just different ones. And we'll give an example of that. The other ones are hierarchical theories, sort of like Spearman, Vernon, and Carroll. Those say that there is such a thing as general intelligence. There's something that you could call, like, you can measure intelligence. And then they're hierarchical because they say, like, within that sort of bigger intelligence mold, there are a lot of different other skills that go into that. But they do all contribute to a general intelligence. Oh, and these slides are posted on my Moodle site. So they're already there, so you can just get that. Spearman came up with this factor G, which is sort of general intelligence. And so essentially he has a two-factor theory, saying that there's a general intelligence that is sort of the summation of everything that we know about it. And then it's composed of different specific factors. So G for general factor, S for specific factors. And so as you remember, Spearman is like pretty much the prototype of the hierarchical model for intelligence. And I know that you might be thinking, like, oh, knowing all these names and all these theories is probably not that important when you're looking at a report. But they're stressed quite a bit in the comps from last year. So that's why I'm devoting the time to this. So for instance, in the Wechsler Scales, there's a FSIQ, which is supposed to be a measure of G, and then there's the specific ones, being like the VCI, the PRI, the WMI, and the PSI, and we'll go over those in a bit. But so essentially, one way of looking at the WISC and WAIS data is falling into Spearman's two-factor theory of intelligence. The other theory of intelligence that is used a lot is the CHC theory, which is Cattell, Horn, and Carroll. From a slide back, I said that Cattell and Horn had, let me go back. So here, Cattell and Horn had a multi-factor theory for intelligence, and Carroll had a hierarchical theory. And so currently, the theory that is actually probably the most used, based on what I've seen, is a combination of both. So it's a combination of the multi-factor theory of Cattell and Horn, as well as a hierarchical theory of Carroll. And it's saying that there is a factor G for general intelligence, but then it's broken into these different, more specific components, like fluid reasoning, knowledge and comprehension, short-term memory, visual processing, auditory processing, long-term storage and retrieval, cognitive processing speed, and quantitative knowledge. And if in looking at WISC, you've seen the Essentials book for the WISC and the WAIS. They essentially give an interpretation of the WISC based on the CHC theory of intelligence. So every time you see things like GC, GV, like those are all based on this theory. And if you look at actually most of contemporary achievement and IQ testing follows this theory to some degree, or it can fit into this. The ones that you would need to know for sure is GF, which is fluid reasoning, or the ability to solve problems based on novel stimuli, and then GC, which is crystallized intelligence, which is being able to use things you already know in more defined situations.
So can you say how this breakdown of G is different than the previous, the two-factor theory? I'm sorry, I was missing it.
Yeah, so the question was, how is this different from the two-factor theory? And in a way, it's not. In a way, what Spearman is saying is that all the different specific factors are sort of interlinked and feed onto G. This is also, the CHC theory is also a two-factor theory, but it specifies specifically what these other components are. And these are seen as often as independent, because they come from the multi-factor theory. And then they sort of all combine, give an aggregate measure of sort of general intelligence. But instead of being components, as it is in the two-factor theory, they're like separate things that combined make up something else. So it's not necessarily all that different, except from how it was developed and what the background is. Does that make sense?
Still a little confused about it.
Right. So essentially, the CHC theory is a two-factor theory, except the development came from a theory of looking at these different specific factors individually. So they're seen as more independent of each other than they would in Spearman's theory.
That makes sense.
So again, some things that are not necessarily directly applicable, but you're still responsible for knowing, is a little bit about the history of intelligence testing. And we'll just go over it really briefly. Essentially just, you should be familiar with the names and sort of what they did. So Francis Galton, around 1869, was considered of psychometrically sound testing. He's the one that came up with a lot of the ways that we use to interpret testing and the sort of the statistics behind it. Pearson also in the early 1900s, that's probably a typo, came up with a lot of the psychometric techniques, like the correlation coefficient, and those are all really also important to the development of IQ testing. The first IQ test was the Binet-Simon scale, which came out originally in France in 1905 by Binet, Henry, and Simon. That was interestingly, right now it's like eventually that became the Stanford Binet, or in the US. But originally it was not to measure intelligence, it was to measure ability for students to do well in a classroom. And in a way, that's still what IQ testing measures. So that was the point. It was to divide for placement, essentially. That was 1905. Then in sort of 1908, Henry Goddard introduced the Binet-Simon scales in the US. And then Louis Terman, in 1916, working at Stanford University, adopted the Binet-Simon scales, made them the Stanford Binet scale, and started using it and norming it on an American population. Terman was also the first person to, in sort of American psychometrics, to use the concept of IQ. Okay. So now, these are a list of intelligence tests that you should know a little bit about. I assume that you've all administered the WAIS and the WISC. And that's because it's one of the ones that is mostly used, most validated. It has its problems, and we're going to go over those those two in a lot more detail. The WIPC I probably should have included with the WAIS and WISC, but the WIPC is a preschool primary scale of intelligence, also Wechsler, and it's sort of a WISC for younger children, and it takes shorter time, and the items are a little bit different.
The WDUG or the WPPSI?
Yes. You probably don't need to know a lot about it. Really just know that it's there and it's used for younger children. Another Wechsler scale that is often not talked about as much is the WASI, the Wechsler Abbreviated Scale of Intelligence, which is very similar to the WAIS. It can be used for children and adults, and it's much, much shorter. Instead of having 10 core subtests that you have to give, you only have to give 4. The 4 subtests that comprise the WASI are vocabulary, similarities, matrix reasoning, and block design. So essentially there's 2 VCI tests and 2 PRI tests, and it gives an estimate of FSIQ. You should probably be aware of it. It's when you're doing a full IQ assessment, you're probably not going to use that because it doesn't take into account other aspects of intelligence, such as working memory and processing speed. Processing speed a little bit, but not enough. Another test is the Stanford Binet 5. That's the latest revision. It came out, I think, in the last couple of years. Something that's important to note about the Stanford Binet is, first of all, Stanford Binet 4 and before was not on the same scale that we're used to, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But the Stanford Binet 4 and 3 and R and all the ones before that had a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 16. Whereas now we use 15, but back then it was 16, and that was the first ones, and those were considered the original IQ points. Stanford Binet 5, just in order to make it more similar to what we learn and the other tests, they changed it so that the standard deviation is now 15. I think that was a question that is common in the licensing exam and to trick people.
I'm sorry to make you repeat, but you said which one's standard deviation of 50?
Most of the tests that we use have a standard deviation of 15.
Or 15, sorry.
The original Stanford Binet and up to Stanford Binet 4 had a standard deviation of 16. So if you see data using older Stanford Binet tests, it's a little bit different. The other thing, as I wrote there about the Stanford Binet, is it tends to have a higher ceiling and a lower ground, which means that compared to the WAIS and the WISC, it measures a wider range. So if you want to test somebody in the severely mentally retarded range or somebody in the gifted range, you probably would want to use Stanford-Binet over over the Weiss scales. Another test is the Woodcock-Johnson 3 test of cognitive abilities. Don't think you have to know a lot about that, just know that it exists. You have to know more about the Woodcock-Johnson achievement test than the cognitive test. But some people choose to do the cognitive and the achievement because they're normed together. Another one that is important to know, for you to know that it exists and you probably don't have to know a lot about, is the Kaufman Assessment Battery for Children. It is also sort of very similar. It measures very similar things. It's only for children. Another test that you... Am I going too fast? Okay. Another one that you actually have...
You said norms for children down to like what age? Like 6?
I think probably lower than that. But I'm not 100% sure. You should refer to the spreadsheet that I showed earlier. The DOS-2 is actually much more used. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about the ethical concerns when it comes to assessing for placement. But essentially it's a differential ability scales. And because the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler scales cannot be used for placement in public schools, the DOS is what is most commonly used, at least in the San Francisco Unified School District. So all educational assessments that you would get, or most of them, are going to use the DOS. And a lot of the tests are very similar to the ones in the WISC, except it doesn't have an FSIQ. It actually doesn't use the term IQ. It doesn't purport to measure intelligence. It measures cognitive ability. I say, what's the difference? But apparently there is. And oftentimes it can also, the different indices, sort of like the verbal part and the nonverbal part, stand alone. So a lot of times in measuring people where English is not their first language, they'll use the DOS and they'll just use the nonverbal portion and say that that's their cognitive ability. So that one's pretty much one of the ones that are mostly used. Has anyone given the DOS here? These two, the lighter R and the Tony 4, are nonverbal tests of intelligence. So if you're testing somebody that is potentially has a very severe expressive language problem, somebody that doesn't speak your language and you don't think an interpreter would be wise to use, then you can use nonverbal tests of intelligence. I'm a little more familiar with the lighter than the Tony. I think this is the lighter International Performance Scale. Even the instructions that are given non-verbally. And so there's a set of tasks that a child has to do, and they're presented sort of by pointing, and all the answers are also given to you by pointing, or mimicking. Then the Tony is the test of nonverbal intelligence. You have to know that it exists and that it's nonverbal also. PPVT is listed in the core concepts as a nonverbal test of intelligence. I've never seen it used like that. The PPVT stands for a Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. It essentially shows pictures and it asks children, what is this? What is this a picture of? And so in a sense, it's limited in terms of how much they can actually speak. They don't actually have to hear anything, and they just have to. But it's essentially a vocabulary test. It goes together with another one called the expressive vocabulary test. So this is how much can they get information and know what it is. And I think it's co-normed with IQ so that it can be used for an estimate. But I think the other tests that are of nonverbal intelligence are used more. Are there any questions? Okay. So when we're looking at scores and looking at this, it's important to know that there is a statistical background to all of this. And you have to know essentially the basic scores and what it means. And I know that 2 weeks ago there was already a session on statistics. So different tests use different scales of measurement. Essentially, there's a standard score with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. That's usually what the FSIQ is given in, the VCI, the PRI, all of the Woodcock-Johnson indices. There's a scaled score, which is similar, but has a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. And that's used, say, for the Wechsler scaled scores of individual subtests. Some tests use a t-score, which has a mean of 10 and a standard deviation mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. And there's also the former Stanford-Binet scores, which, as I mentioned before, have a standard deviation of 16. So, and this is important to know so that you know sort of like when you give it, if you got a score on a test and it says, well, the person got a t-score of 30, you can probably know like, oh, that's 2 standard deviations below the mean. That's probably not so great. So we'll talk about the Wechsler Scales because that's really what you have to know the most about. They are the most widely used IQ test or intelligence test that we have now. It has really good psychometric properties. It has a pretty decent normative sample. And it's what we get taught, so it's easier for us to use it. The problem with the Wechsler Scales, and it's not really just the Wechsler Scales, it's also Stanford-Binet and I believe the Woodcock-Johnson, is that it cannot be used in public schools. The reason for that is a court decision, Larry P. versus Riles, where it was determined that certain tests cannot be used for educational placement. That is because differentially, people of different ethnic groups performed different. And it was found that it was actually bias in the test as opposed to differences within the groups. And so now it can't be used because it's unfair to people of non-dominant backgrounds. So instead, people use the DOS or the KABC. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I should even bother you, but there's so many places that still do. Like if you're testing in a Catholic school, they would still use it for a minority population. And is that really, like how much do you need to adjust then?
Well, the question was that the Wechsler Scales are still used in some non-public schools, and what you would have to do to adjust it. Essentially, you can use the test at any point, and that's not breaking the law. You just can't use it for placement. Mm-hmm. And when you do the interpretation, you would still have to say, hey, this test has been shown to underestimate the performance of African Americans, for instance. And then you would keep that in mind when you do the interpretation. There's a Spanish version of the WISC that is normed specifically with Hispanic populations, and it gives you sort of the FSIQ, but then also corrected FSIQ for each of the indices. So if you're testing Hispanics, you can use that, or Latinos. For other cultures, I'm not aware of any correction. But again, the Wechsler Scales give a lot of other information other than IQ, and the only hindrance is that they can't be used for placement. Most children that are in schools and get tested for IQ is for placement for an IEP, and so they tend to just say like, okay, we're not going to use this. In our practicum sites and in our own clinical work, sometimes it's beneficial to use a WISC to test a child, even if they are in public schools, because that way there's no practice effects whenever like San Francisco Unified School District school psychologist does the formal assessment. Other things about the Wechsler Scales is, well, there are 3 different ones. There's, as I mentioned, the WIPSI, which goes from 2 years, 6 months to 7 years, 3 months. The WISC, which goes from 6 years to 16, 11. and then the WAIS, which goes from 16 to 90, almost 91. So throughout 90. There is considerable overlap, and so usually it's based on clinical judgment whether you would want to use, let's say you're testing a 16-year-old. Like, would you want to use the WISC or would you want to use the WAIS? That's because throughout that entire year you could use both. And usually the way that that it's talked about is like it's your own clinical judgment based on the maturity of the student. If there's a very mature 16-year-old, you probably want to use the WAIS because otherwise the WISC is not going to give a proper, the best measure. And the same goes with the WIPSI. Questions? Not as important. There are other versions of the Wechsler Scales. Wechsler. There's a WISC integrated, which is like a big bag or a big box, and it essentially has a lot of different normed tools for testing of limits. So if you remember, sometimes you do everything the way the manual says, and you want to see, well, what is, like, go a little bit further into, like, well, is it that they don't get what they're supposed to do? Do they not know it? And so you can sometimes, after you administer everything, go back and, like, give answers in multiple choice format. Like, can they at least recognize the right answer? That is sort of normed together and specifically done in the WISC integrated. There's also the WAIS NI, which is the WAIS as a neuropsychological instrument. So it's the same WAIS, but it has a different emphasis. And it has extra tools, like extra blocks for block design and other stuff to be used for neuropsych. And we'll go a little bit more into that. Just know that it exists. That's all you need to know. And the WASI, which I've already talked about, which only has four subtests.
I just have a quick question. I know I came in late. It said cannot be used in public schools, Larry P. versus Wiles, and I know that has to do with African American children, but is that in general? Can it not be used in public schools?
For placement. So it can't be used for, the question was whether that, the reason that it was found that it was underestimating the performance of African American students. But in general, just it can't be used for placement because of the bias. Essentially, Wechsler has this nice way of categorizing, giving names to it. You should probably know these, at least the standard score ones, so that you know what range is a high average, you know what range is low average. I've tried to find an easy way to remember these, and I just can't seem to do it. So if you do, please let me know. So at this point, it's probably just best to commit those classifications for and the numbers that it corresponds to just in memory. So I know if I'm going to try to go fast over this because I know that most of you probably have already done it. If you need me to slow down, please let me know. I'm going to go over the WAIS and the WISC just because that's sort of important to know. So the WAIS-4 has 10 core subtests. The different subtests go into different indices that measure sort of different global abilities. So in a way, we can see that here we're building this sort of hierarchical notion of intelligence. That the abilities that measure these three subtests, so similarity, vocabulary, and information, are all verbal subtests. And they give one index of verbal ability. Block design, matrix reasoning, visual puzzles give an estimate for sort of perceptual reasoning or ability to think non-verbally. Digit span and arithmetic comprise the working memory index, which is how well you can hold information, usually numbers, in and use them just in your sort of immediate awareness or immediate attention. And then symbol search and coding, which are non-verbal items that measure how fast people can process, so it's processing speed. The idea is if there are all these four indices, and then they comprise G. They comprise the FSIQ. So it's sort of multi-tiered hierarchical model of intellectual potential. However, when the Wechsler scales were developed and like studied, there's always some times where if there's a significant difference between the VCI, PRI, WMI, and the PSI, then you can't say that there is one measure of cognitive ability because it's too different. It's too different. So at that point, instead of saying there's a hierarchical model where the VCI, PRI, WMI, and PSI form a global index, you just look at them independently. Or you get a GAI, which I will talk about. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? So let's look at these a little more closely. Oh, wait, before that, there are also 5 supplemental subtests. There's comprehension, figure weights, figure completion, letter number sequencing, and cancellation. They all also can load onto one of the indices. Why have supplemental subtests? Well, sometimes something goes wrong in the administration of one of the core ones, and then you can't calculate the index. When that happens, you can substitute for one of these. Sometimes they're just given in addition to, even if you're not going to look at them, because there's a lot of discrepancy, or there's something that seemed a little off when you administered, say, the VCI subtest, and you want to have a way of assessing a little bit more and break it down a little bit more. So you would probably want to administer some of the subtests. But generally, they're used to substitute into and load onto the different indices that we were talking about. The general rules are, for the FSIQ or for the index to be valid, you cannot substitute more than 2 tests for the entire WISC or WACE, and you can't substitute more than 1 for each index. But a lot of people just give all of them, and then they say, well, I'm going to use it just for additional information because I really want to break down this person's perceptual reasoning and see what's wrong with it. And that's, I know, a different way of looking at intelligence testing, not really looking for indices, but looking at what does each specific subtest measure. And if there's a big difference between one and the other, well, how can we tease out what the problem is? And that's actually a lot of what we're going to go later when, like, how would you use the WACE to look at neuropsychology? Neuropsychologists usually don't really look at indices. They don't care what the VCI is. All they want to know is, well, similarities measures one thing, they scored really low, that means that this part of the brain might not be working as well.
So what do you mean by you can substitute up to 2 tests? Not when you're doing the FSIQ, right? You wouldn't replace one with the other.
So the question is, what do I mean by substituting? Yeah, if you're giving, for instance, similarities, or if you're giving vocabulary, and you realize that you didn't query enough, so you're essentially making the test invalid, you can use comprehension instead. And where you're calculating the VCI and the FSIQ, you would use comprehension instead of similarities.
So that's mostly if you made an administrative error.
Right.
But if they did poorly on the core, you wouldn't then substitute if they did better on the supplemental.
It depends on why you think they did really poorly.
Mm-hmm.
If you think, like, if you can make the case that the reason that they scored really low in vocabulary is because they're a non-native English speaker and their fund of knowledge is probably not developed a lot in English, you could probably use comprehension instead, because it's the test itself would not be valid because of the linguistic and cultural issues. But yeah, no more than 1 substitution per index and no more than 2 for the entire test. The reason that they're supplemental is because oftentimes they don't have as much validity. So it's sort of a trade-off. Like, you're giving away some of the validity inherent in the test, but that's better than having a test that's completely invalid because of the way you administered it or because of the person that you're administering it to. So the WISC and the WACE, they're almost the same, right? The difference is when you're looking at the VCI, you use comprehension instead of information. Can you think of why they would do that for the WISC?
Children aren't going to have as much information probably about life and the world and whatever questions they have.
Right, so children wouldn't necessarily have as much knowledge of information. And information is really tied to how they learn in school. It's not about IQ. It's not about it's less about what they know and more about what they've been taught. So it's a little unfair because it's related to what school do you go to? Is it a good school? Is it not? And IQ is supposed to be separate from achievement. We'll deal with achievement and knowledge later, but for an adult, they found out that people should know these things, adults regardless of where they went to school. But information here, it's so tied into academics that it wasn't fair. The other test that's different is that the WISC uses letter number sequencing instead of arithmetic. Essentially for the same reason. We can't assume that children have been taught the right math skills. And because we're trying to get this test to be separate from school and more about potential, then they substitute that one as well. Does that make sense?
Okay, so those are the two that they separate, correct?
Right. Everything else is the same.
Okay.
And I think, at least the way I think, I find it easier to think of them as the same test with a couple modifications than having to learn two different tests. So that's why I'm presenting it this way. And the tests in red are the ones that are different. Any questions? Are we all right moving forward? And it has essentially the same supplementals except for the ones that were swapped out, right? Information is now a supplemental and arithmetic is now a supplemental. So now, part of what makes the Wechsler Scales very useful is that every subtest measures a different set of abilities. And oftentimes, they're in the manual, they're sort of floating online. Different people think a little bit different things, but I've all the different tests I put here, and I put broadly what they're supposed to measure. So vocabulary, so the VCI measures general verbal abilities, but there are a lot of things that go into general verbal abilities, and the different tests measure different parts of verbal abilities. So, for instance, the vocabulary test measures word knowledge and the degree of language development, fund of lexical word knowledge, learning ability, because you have to learn the words in order to be able to define them, long-term memory, and verbal concept formation. So those are the things that vocabulary measures. So if a child does really, or an adult does really bad in vocabulary, you can start thinking about what could have happened, or why is it that their language development is not there? Is it that they have a hearing problem and they just have a difficulty with that? And so you compare different abilities in different tests to figure out what it is that's going on for the person. And vocabulary essentially says, ask the student or the examinee to define a word. And it measures sort of concept formation because it can be, they have to know what it is and be able to succinctly define it. And there's usually when they have a scale of 0, 1, and 2, it's not because the definitions are right or wrong, but there are different levels of right. So the most concise, the most abstract, the most coherent response is going to be a 2-point answer. One where they know what it is, but they don't have a degree of language development enough to be able to provide the concept in and of itself, is probably going to be a 1-point response. Similarities asked examinees to say how two different concepts are alike. And they start with something very simple, like dog and cat, I don't remember the exact items, and it goes up to like how are space and time alike? How are they the same? And what it requires is the examinee take two different concepts, two different words, make them into concepts in their head, and be able to see similarities in the concepts. So it's a very sort of, it's a higher order sort of learned ability than just vocabulary. And what it measures is verbal reasoning. Can they reason using words and a concept formation? Information subtest, and here I clumped whisk and waste, just subtests. So information is the ability to like learn and retain information, which, as we talked about, is one of the components of intelligence, according to the people that study this. And it's usually very simple, like very factual knowledge. Who was Mahatma Gandhi? What country is the Sahara Desert in? Comprehension measures verbal reasoning and conceptualization, evaluating from past experiences, so being able to draw generalizations and conclusions, verbal comprehension and expression, and how to use practical information. So essentially, it's a test of judgment. Can you use what you've learned in the past and say what you would do in new situations? And then word reasoning measures deductive reasoning. That come from?
Sorry, I couldn't write fast enough. What did you say for word reasoning? Would you repeat that?
Word reasoning, I think it's an old subtest. No, it's there. It's just deductive reasoning. It's a sort of optional test. So the PRI measures nonverbal reasoning. So you did the VCI was all verbal. The PRI is all nonverbal. So block design, you give the examinee blocks, and then you give them a stimulus, and they say they have to use the blocks to build a figure. And it measures the ability to synthesize abstract verbal stimuli and nonverbal concept formation. So you have the verbal concept formation in the similarities, and now you have nonverbal from block design. So you can really have a comparison of these two abilities for a person. Is maybe that's something that's going wrong, or maybe that's something that's a particular skill. It also measures constructional skills, apparently. Matrix reasoning has some drawings, and then it has one missing, and the person has to sort of multiple choice out of the options that are presented, what would fit there. And it really measures fluid reasoning, general intelligence, intellectual ability, because it uses a lot of different skills, continuous and discrete pattern completion, and then there are different types of items. Some of them measure the ability to classify items into a whole, so it would measure sort of abstraction. Some measure analogical reasoning, so more like similarities, like how are two things the same, and serial reasoning, like what fits next in this pattern. The visual puzzles subtest. It measures visual recognition and identification, perception of parts to a whole, and visual spatial reasoning and fluid reasoning. Figure completion has measures visual perception and organization, concentration, visual recognition. And then picture concepts measures abstract categorical reasoning ability. So when you look at the subtests based on what they measure, it's a lot easier to make a hypothesis about what the real strengths and weaknesses are. And in fact, some people say don't even look at indices, because they say, well, if you're measuring all these things, what does the index tell you? And they just look at specific separate abilities. So is this useful? Should I, or?
Actually, can you go back? I was trying to see the last one. Picture concept.
And of course, when there's a big discrepancy between these, then the PRI would not be necessarily a coherent measure of nonverbal reasoning, because you need things to be about the same, so within 5 points of each other, for you to be able to say, like, okay, nonverbal reasoning within, generally can be seen as a coherent unit.
Do questions on the comps address this knowledge, or is it more about interpreting?
You could have a question that, so the question was if questions on the comp will address this, or is it more about interpreting scores? They'll be both. So you'd be expected to know, with the WISC the WACE, it's harder to interpret because it's a lot more clear.
Can you give an example of a question?
A question, for instance, an example of a question would be, which of the following WISC for subtests would involve visual motor scanning? Which of these tests would you expect to be lower in a student that has ADD? And so if you know what they measure, you can sort of figure it out. And we'll also talk about that. Yes?
If we want to pursue, let's say, a class in neuropsychology next year, is it important for us to know the Wechsler scales?
Yeah, in fact, I think every single, the question was that if people are interested in neuropsychology, if Wechsler scales are really important, and the answer is most definitely yes. As I mentioned before, there's even a version of the WACE that is the WACE as a neuropsychological instrument. And because a lot of neuropsychology really involves looking at these specific skills. The difference between sort of what we're doing now in psychodiagnostic assessment and neuropsychological assessment is saying, well, here we're saying, well, they have a problem synthesizing abstract visual stimuli. Whereas when you look at it from a neuropsychological perspective, it's tied into what parts of the brain would be affected if somebody has a difficulty synthesizing abstract visual stimuli. So it'd be okay, if they score really low on block design and they have a certain type of characteristics errors, it's likely going to be somewhere in the posterior parietal lobe, stuff like that, I think. So the next index is the WMI, so working memory. And it measures the ability to keep and manipulate information, mostly mathematical, like numbers and letters. And so working memory is a little bit difficult because it's sort of, if you remember, for instance, digit span, there are 3 different digit span subtests. There's digit span forward, digit span backward, and digit span sequencing. And each of those measure something different. But digit span, you give a string of numbers, each spaced a second apart, and then first they have to give them back to you, then they have to give them back to you backwards, and then they have to order them from lowest to highest. The skills that it measures is auditory short-term memory, ability to sequence, and attention and concentration. Sequencing would be obviously only the sequencing part. Digit span forward is more sensitive to just attention and concentration and pure retention, whereas digit span backwards and digit span sequencing involves also the ability to manipulate information in your mind. And so that's why when you look at the differences, it can be interesting when somebody does really well on digit span forward but completely does really bad on the other two. You can make a hypothesis about the fact that it's not that they can't keep things there, it's they can't do something with it. Arithmetic measures mental manipulation, concentration, attention, short and long-term memory, numerical reasoning, and mental alertness. Essentially, you give them a problem, and they have to give you a math problem, and they have to give you the answer without putting it down on a piece of paper. And then letter number sequencing is similar to digit span sequencing, but it uses both numbers and letters, and you give a string of them mixed, and they have to give you in order first the numbers, then the letters. And it measures sequencing, mental manipulation, attention, short-term auditory memory, visual spatial imaging, that's the numbers and letters part, and processing speed. And for those of you that came late, these slides are all posted on my Moodle, so you can you have access to those. Lastly, the PSI is a measure of processing speed. They all measure processing speed. There's not that much more to that, at least on a first order approximation. And they just measure, processing speed, how quickly they can deal with new information, short-term visual memory, visual motor coordination, cognitive flexibility. They have to go from numbers to symbols, cognitive flexibility, visual discrimination, and concentration. So, let's sit down for this part. So you have to know a little bit about, and this all makes more sense when you know what sort of abilities. Am I still on view? Okay. What sort of what would it look like when somebody has a certain deficit? So, somebody that has ADHD, what do you think would be their strengths and what would be their weaknesses? Just based on all that gigantic amount of information that I just tried to cover in the last 10 minutes.
Processing speed would be a weakness.
Right. So processing speed would definitely be a weakness.
Particularly coding.
And especially coding, right. What about their VCI? What about their verbal skills? Any guesses?
I guess I'd be stronger.
Right. So usually people with ADHD, they have low processing speed because they can't focus their attention on the task at hand. But their VCI, their vocabulary, their information is going to be really high, or as high as there's going to be a very big discrepancy. Also, another set of subtests that measure attention and sort of more sustained attention would be the working memory. So you would also expect working memory to be pretty low, especially as a set of numbers get a little bit bigger. What about depression?
Again, I think processing speed would be weaker.
Yeah, so processing speed would be weaker. And how would you then draw a hypothesis about whether it's ADHD or depression?
Using other measures in your battery.
Right, you would use other measures, but I would also look at block design. Somebody that's really depressed is probably not going to do all that great in block design because of the sort of whole psychomotor components of depression. So yeah, they're not going to be able to give us much attention, but their block design is probably also going to be lower. Same as the case with anxiety. People with anxiety often don't do well in processing speed because they tend to be perfectionistic and try to move very slowly. That's also going to come out in block design.
So you'd see a difference between a kid with ADHD and depression and block design.
Right. Because somebody with so the question was that block design would be, whether or not block design would be something that I would look at to determine if there's a difference between depression and ADHD, and definitely. Somebody with ADHD tends to sometimes do really well with novel stimuli, especially when they're playing with blocks, and they're like trial and error. So the children with ADHD will tend to not do that bad. Something else that's unique to ADHD and not diagnostic, but something that I would certainly consider, is if there's just a lot of scatter between the different subtests within an index and between indices. So if I see that when I look at a profile and I see that nothing makes sense, like their scores all over the place, I'm going to think ADHD because attention waxes and wavers. So sometimes maybe they'll do okay in something but really poorly in another, and that's pretty typical for ADHD, especially in children.
For there to be large discrepancies between the subtests.
Right, so for that, yeah, there would be large discrepancies, and so maybe they'll do, VCI tends to be very high for ADHD, and then everything else is all over the place, with a particular weakness in processing speed.
Would you also find the VCI to be higher in depression?
Yes. The VCI would also be higher in depression. And what about learning disorders? What would you expect to see in learning disorders?
Possibly like the same across the profile, but then maybe one area just lower. Like, I don't know, I would think that whatever their learning disorder may be in that area is going to be, you know, really weak when everything else is kind of average.
That's one possibility, when it's just one area of impairment, that everything will be okay and then something will be substantially below the mean, their own mean. The other thing is just paying attention to what are the subtests that measure things that are learned in school, that require learning. So if you give arithmetic, well, arithmetic depends on not only attention and working memory, but also, you know, ability to do math problems, and that's going to be very low. Vocabulary is probably going to be lower than similarities, because they might not have the word knowledge. They might have difficulty reading. What else? Information, if it's an adult, would also be fairly low. If it's an issue of attention, you would see working memory also being pretty low. But it also depends on sort of what the different learning disability is. Does this make sense? I think instead of just saying like this is what the literature says, it makes more sense to think about it in terms of like what are we measuring? What are we doing with these? And what makes sense?
I like this. I wish we did more of this. I don't know. I feel like we don't do a lot of kind of interpreting what this actually means and understand. I like this.
Applying it.
Yeah.
And that's all what neuropsych is all about, actually, I think. So giftedness is something we often don't talk about. As I said before, the Stanford Binet scales have a higher ceiling, so it's probably better than using the Wechsler scales. Usually diagnosing giftedness is used in terms of putting students in programs, like the GATE program for gifted education. And that depends on state guidelines. In California, it requires a sort of FSIQ, or sort of a general cognitive ability of greater than 120, with no verbal subtests lower than 120. So the idea being like they can have a learning disability, but like their FSIQ has to be super high, and they on the COG-AT, which is I guess another measure. Some other states, for instance, Pennsylvania, require an IQ of 130 or above to be diagnosed as gifted and be able to be eligible for that. Usually, at least in California, there are three ways that you can put somebody in a gifted program. One is if they have an FSIQ of over 120. The other is if they have like really high academic achievement. So regardless of IQ, if they're performing really, really well, if they're in like either the 85th or 90th percentile, depending on how old they are, they can be eligible regardless of IQ. Or if they have one specific academic ability where they're just outstanding. So if they're like off the charts in math, but everything else is sort of like high average, they can sometimes still be eligible to be to fall into to be for programs. But I would sort of put more emphasis on just knowing that like FSIQ 120 or 130 or above is what you would need to say that somebody is gifted. Some states like more holistic things, so they're like, and the person has to be creative and show these other skills, which is really great as well, because it's focusing less on scores and school learned tasks. Other questions about this? There's sort of like criteria that you just keep in mind, and there might be a question or so. Now on the other side of the scale, there's mental retardation. In order to diagnose mental retardation, you need an FSIQ of less than 70, which you can remember as being 2 standard deviations below the mean. And then there are further categories, is based on the DSM-4, different categories for mental retardation. There's mild mental retardation, which goes from like 50 or 55 to 70. And that whole 50 to 55, I think it's easier to just think of the higher number, so like 55 to 70, because that's anywhere between 2 and 3 standard deviations below the mean. 3 to 4 standard deviations above the mean is moderate mental retardation. Severe is sort of 3 to 4 standard deviations above the mean, and profound would be less than 4 standard deviations above the mean. That's a typo.
What was the typo? Sorry.
Should be less than. This should be less than 4 standard deviations below the mean.
Oh, okay.
But IQ is not enough to diagnose mental retardation. It has to be with an onset before age 18. So in other words, like, it essentially has to be a developmental issue, not an acquired one. So if you have a head trauma and end up having mental deficits, it's not considered mental retardation. And what a lot of people forget about, you also have to have deficits in adaptive functioning. And we'll go over adaptive functioning and then we'll take a break. So when somebody shows a very low IQ, then it's important to think about adaptive functioning. And there are several ways to measure adaptive functioning. You can use, in a way, the CBCL, which will be covered next week, I believe. But the most common way, or the way you have to know to look at adaptive functioning is the Vineland 2. It used to be the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales. And the one thing that I don't like about the Vineland is that they use V-scores, which nobody else uses, which have a mean of 15 and a standard deviation of 3. Probably you don't have to know that. So there are 2 different ways that you can administer the Vineland. There's a survey interview form, which is essentially you open this booklet and you start asking questions. Is your child able to follow one-step instructions? Is your child able to use a microwave without supervision? Is your child able to open a can with a can opener by his own? Can your child travel alone in public transportation 5 miles away from home? Can he do it 10 miles away from home? And so in the different domains, it goes in sort of like higher difficulty or so. The other one is just a parent-caregiver rating form, which has the exact same questions, but it's in a form that you can just give it to them and say, answer these about your child. The Vineland has 4 areas of functioning, which are essentially the 4 areas that you would consider part of adaptive functioning. So these are the 4, and then these are the different sort of sub-parts that go into it. So the first one is communication. So can they understand things? Can they follow instructions? Multi-step, presented orally, different situations. Then you go and talk about expressive. Can they tell you can your child tell you what they need? Can they verbalize? Can they use sentences? Can they write a note when their milk is not in the fridge? Something. And written. Then it's daily living skills. Can they, how are they like living in a community? Can they get dressed? Can they shower on their own? Can they dry their hair? A lot of children with adaptive functioning, like they shower, but they never dry their hair. Domestic, can they cook? Can they use appliances? Can they turn on the light? And then community, like do they have supports in the community? Do they have activities outside? The next domain that the Vineland measures of adaptive functioning is socialization. Do they have friends? Do they talk to other people in their families? Interpersonal relationships. Play and leisure time. Do they do something that gives them pleasure? Do they have activities? Do they have groups? And then coping skills. Like what do they do when they get upset? Can they manage their own affect? Can they deal with things going wrong? The last one, which is sort of not necessarily core, is motor skills, and that's really to assess for developmental issues, and that's only given up to age 6, and it's divided into gross and fine motor function. So it's like, can your child move? Can your child turn over? Stand up? Usually, when you're doing with somebody that's over age 6, you just will completely ignore that. There's another optional maladaptive behavior, which is a little bit more like, maybe it's not adaptive functioning, but like, are there conduct problems? Are there, it's encaprices, enuresis, a lot of other maladaptive behaviors that can come up. And that's really, I've never seen it used because people often would rather use a CBCL for that. So why don't we take a break, like 10 minutes, and then come back?